Chapter 16 of The Alps, the Danube, and the Near East. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Betty B. In the Footsteps of the Habsburgs. Yesterday I spent in talks with the men who are directing Austria in the paths of health and sanity. Today I have been following in the footsteps of the haughty rulers whose mistaken policies drove the nation to the verge of despair. The Habsburgs belong to one of the oldest of the royal houses of Europe. The first of them, an old robber baron named Rudolph, took the throne of Austria more than 200 years before Columbus discovered America. It was in 1273 that the family began to live at the expense of the people, and they fed at the public crib from then until the twilight of the kings that came with the World War. How well they fared one may guess by going through their mighty palaces, now open to sightseers who tramp through rooms once reserved exclusively for royalty. I visited this afternoon a little summer palace that you will not find mentioned in the guidebooks. It was built by Francis Joseph for his wife, the Empress Elizabeth, who was stabbed in Geneva by an anarchist nearly 3 decades ago. It was afterward used as a sort of hunting lodge by the royal family. This palace is a cream-colored brick building of the dimensions of a seaside hotel, and has about it a tract of 7,000 acres of forest with magnificent lawns and long winding paths and roadways. The house is filled with beautiful paintings, and one great hall has its ceiling and walls decorated with scenes from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. There are some pieces of splendid furniture, including beds as wide as the great bed at Ware. One plain simple room was the emperor's own. It is the room of a hermit. Francis Joseph had no frills and furbelows about him, and his bed was of a 3/4 size and made of iron. I can buy dozens just like it in any town in America for $10 apiece. I inquired in vain for the bathroom, for there is none, although the building is lighted by electricity. The palace is now rented for a sum equal in our money to $200 a year. For 6½ centuries, the Habsburg monarchs lived in the great, rambling group of buildings in Vienna, known as the Hofburg. Now many of those rooms that witnessed the pomp and circumstance of court life echo to the clack of modern typewriters, and the walls look down on clerks and officials at their daily business routine, some of them seated on gilded chairs at buhl tables. In 1805, when Napoleon was bombarding Vienna, there lay in the Hofburg a young princess who had been too ill to leave the city with the rest of the imperial family. When the French general learned of this, he ordered that the direction of the guns be changed so that the palace might be spared. Thus he perhaps saved the life of Marie Louise, who a few years later became his wife and the Empress of the French. One of the buildings of the Hofburg still houses the old riding school, founded by Charles VI in 1729, and ever since famous for its magnificent Spanish horses. It was kept up for the pleasure of the imperial family, who used to give private performances for their friends. When Dr. Zimmermann, the expert brought to Austria from Holland to carry out the plans of the League of Nations for her rehabilitation, was looking about for possible economies, his eye fell on the riding school. It seemed doomed to go, but the chief riding master declared that he would make his stable self-supporting. This he has done by having a drill every now and then, to which anyone is admitted upon the payment of a fee. So now commoners sit in the royal box and watch the 28 splendid stallions that are left go through their paces. Schönbrunn was the emperor's summer residence and was accessible to the public only during his absence. It is now the great holiday resort of the people. There were thousands moving about through the grounds when I went there last Sunday. I visited the swimming pool, which covers at least half an acre and is so deep that no one except a giant like Goliath, who, as I remember it, was 9 feet 9 inches tall, could stand up in it. It was filled with men and women who had paid a few cents apiece for the privilege of swimming there. This pool was sacred to the Empress Elizabeth, who had it made deep, for she was one of the great imperial athletes of her time and loved to hunt and ride and swim. Schönbrunn has a park of 500 acres of woods surrounding its magnificent gardens. It stands on the site of a hunting lodge erected in 1570, and the present building was begun in 1696. Maria Theresa often lived at Schönbrunn, and she planned its present form. It was modeled after the palace at Versailles. For a palace, the building itself is not large, being a two-story structure only 650 feet long. There are seats round the garden which contain perhaps 20 acres of lawns and beautiful flower pots. In some places, benches are free to all, but one is charged for a seat on the iron chairs. I took 2 chairs for myself and my companion, and a little later an old woman came around and told me the fee was 180 kronen each. I handed her a 1,000 kronen note, and she started away. I called her back, demanding my change. She grumbled, but handed me back 640 crowns, which I was tempted to return, but my friend objected, saying that the woman had overcharged us and that it would not do to reward her dishonesty. The amount in question was less than 3/4 of a cent. Every part of Schönbrunn is rich in historical association. From where I sat I could see the Gloriette, the stone pavilion to which Maria Theresa used so often to retire with her problems of state. When she grew so fat that her weak ankles would not permit her to climb stairs, she had a kind of elevator made to raise her to the balcony on the top of the colonnade, whence she commanded a fine view across the parks and gardens to the city, then several miles away. In 1805, and again 4 years later, Napoleon made the palace his headquarters during his occupation of Vienna. In the courtyard here he held reviews of his troops, while crowds of the Viennese looked on and marveled at the little man who had subjugated Europe. It was to this palace that, following Napoleon's abdication, Marie-Louise returned with her young son, the King of Rome. And here, as the Duke of Reichstadt, the boy died at the age of 21 in the same room and even in the same bed that his father had occupied as the conqueror of Austria. Another bedroom in the palace was that of Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, the brother of Francis Joseph. On the wall hangs his portrait, beside that of his wife Carlotta, who, as you remember, went insane with grief when her husband was shot. Kings and emperors have their advantages in that they can construct fine buildings, establish opera houses and theaters, and gather together paintings and sculptures that may be enjoyed by all. For example, there is the votive church in Vienna with Gothic towers that remind one of Cologne Cathedral, although this edifice is much smaller. One February afternoon in 1853, the young and popular Emperor Francis Joseph was walking on the old fortification wall of Vienna when a Hungarian fanatic tried to plunge a dagger into the monarch's neck. But the emperor's military collar, stiff with gold lace and braid, turned the assassin's knife, and later on this church was set up as a thank you offering for the ruler's escape from death. One of the strangest sacred buildings I know of is the Loreto Chapel, built in 1627 as part of the court church by the wife of Ferdinand II for the purpose it has served since then. Here in silver urns are preserved the hearts of the emperors and empresses who have ruled in Austria during the past 3 centuries. Until about 300 years ago, the royal dead were buried in St. Stephen's Cathedral, but since then they have been laid in the crypt of the old church of the Capuchins. A double sarcophagus contains the bodies of Maria Theresa and her idolized and handsome husband, Francis I. Nearby are the coffins of all except one of their 16 children. Not far away are the remains of Marie-Louise, Empress of the French, and of her son, the Duke of Reichstadt. Here too lies Maximilian of Mexico. After the ill-fated dictator was shot, Emperor Francis Joseph asked Juarez, the president of Mexico, to allow the remains to be returned to Austria. At last this request was granted, and in the same ship in which Maximilian and Carlotta had sailed to the New World on their great adventure, the body was borne back to Austria for burial. Beside a statue of the Virgin reposes the Empress Elizabeth, the most beautiful queen in all Europe until her life was shattered by the death of her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, whose coffin is near her own. He committed suicide 8 years after his unhappy marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium. His mother sank gradually into greater and greater depths of melancholy and spent less and less of her time in Austria. She probably cared but little when the assassin at Geneva plunged his sharpened shoemaker's awl into her heart. It was not until 18 years later that her husband, the aged Francis Joseph, at length came to rest with his ancestors in the vault. He is the last of the Habsburgs to lie there, for his nephew and successor Charles is buried where he died in exile. His body is in Funchal on the island of Madeira, though some day it may be taken up and brought to the Church of the Capuchins. End of chapter 16.